Elizabeth Anderson is McShane Professor of Public Philosophy, John Dewey Distinguished University Professor, and Arthur Turneau Professor at the University of Michigan. She specializes in moral, social, and political philosophy, feminist theory, social epistemology, and the philosophy of economics and the social sciences. She is particularly interested in exploring the interactions of social science with moral and political theory, how we learn to improve our value judgments, the epistemic functions of emotions and democratic deliberation, and issues of race, gender, and equality. After Elizabeth's presentation of about 20-25 minutes, we will proceed with some commentaries and questions of the participants in our seminar. So Elizabeth, whenever you want.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be able to talk with you today. So I'm just going to go quickly through the basic themes of Hijacked. And we could start off by considering Max Weber's account of the Protestant work ethic in his classic work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. The core of Weber's argument was that the Protestant ethic began as an ethic in order to attain assurance of salvation, but it ended up turning into a secular rationale for the capitalist exploitation of workers. He stressed that the work ethic led to the spirit of capitalism, which is the idea of wealth accumulation through the capitalist exploitation of workers' willingness to work hard, and that capitalists, according to this ethic, were entitled to extract profits by any legal means. Workers then would bear all of the duties of the work ethic: industry, frugality, asceticism, and capitalists would get all the rewards. That's profits. And he condemned this ethic for leading everyone into an iron cage. In his famous expression, the Puritan wanted to work at a calling, but we are forced to do so by market forces. So, and his critique still stings today because we live in a neoliberal world where this ethic is in fact imposed by capitalists on workers. So that's why what he says today rings true to us. Nevertheless, if we go back and read the original Puritan theologians who he cites, we find a very different picture. It is true that they insisted that industry, frugality, and asceticism were important values. But they also stressed, and this is the parts that Weber didn't tell us, was that they promised rewards for workers on this earth, not just in the next life. So if we look at Richard Baxter, who's the premier theologian of the work ethic, Baxter argued that the duty to find a calling led to a right to free occupational choice, and so did Robert Sanderson. Had the same view. And on what basis do we choose our occupation? It's basically the core idea is the idea of meaningful work, that you should find work that helps others by using skills that one enjoys exercising. Okay. All of them stress the dignity of all workers. If you're working hard, you're entitled to dignity and respect of other people. They stress that even the most menial workers are doing God's work. They stress that employers have strict duties to workers. They can't just boss them around and tyrannically. They have to offer living wages and safe and healthful conditions. And the poor who are unable to support themselves have a right to charity from others. They also insisted that the rich have duties of their own. So they're not allowed to just live off their wealth idly. They opposed business models that were based essentially on mere wealth extraction, just extracting wealth from other people. Baxter claimed that it was a constant calamity and a prison to be tied to spend one's life in doing little good at all to others, though he should grow rich by it himself. That's a warning to contemporary financiers and consultants who are simply looking for ways to maximize profits by taking advantage of everybody else in the system without actually promoting the welfare of other people. Baxter, in his business ethics, defined these extractive and exploitative business models as oppression, term that we like to use today. He insists that you're not supposed, it's wrong to take advantage of people just because of their desperation, poverty, and vulnerability. He attacked monopolists, usurers, all kinds of scam artists, hucksters who are selling stuff that isn't nearly as good as they claim, landlords who unfairly evict their tenants from the land, all kinds of exploitative business models. Locke, who's also an advocate of the work ethic, also opposed price discrimination against the poor and desperate. If you're willing to sell something to somebody, you have to sell it at the same price, even to somebody who would be willing to pay more just because they're so desperate. And in general, they advance what I call a class-neutral ethic, right? The same duties apply to the rich and the poor, and everybody has to play their part in the division of labor to help other people and not oppress them. So what happened to the work ethic? My argument is in the late 18th century, the work ethic splits off into two different versions. We have the capitalist work ethic, which I call the Protestant work ethic, or the conservative work ethic. And then we have the work ethic articulated on behalf of the workers themselves, which I call the progressive work ethic. And that division takes place because the Industrial Revolution shifted fundamentally the division of labor. If you look back in the 17th century, Puritan times, the typical worker actually had some access to returns from capital. 17th century England was the era of premier yeoman farmers. Okay, even if they didn't own the land, they had very long-term leases and consequently could get returns from investing in greater fertility of the soil and other farm long-term investments in the productivity of their farm. Craftsmen owned their own shops. Journeymen owned their own tools. Even merchant seamen were entitled to a share of the profits. They were not wage laborers in that sense. What the Industrial Revolution did was basically take workers who both enjoyed the returns from labor and certain kind of returns from capital, and they split it off into two sharply divided classes. Capitalists on the one hand, who are getting returns simply on the basis of asset ownership, and wage laborers on the other, who own nothing but their own labor. And because of that sharper class division, the work ethic itself splits up into the capitalist or conservative work ethic is the one that Weber condemned, where only workers have these duties of frugality, industry, and asceticism, right? And the rich, right, just get to be served by the workers. And then the progressive work ethic, or the work ethic for workers, which you continue to unite the duties and the benefits of work. You don't have the duties on one class and the benefits yielded to the other class. And in this progressive work ethic, also, the contrast between the conservative and the progressive work ethic is encapsulated in two basic ideas. One is a purely economic idea. it has to do with what are the institutions and arrangements that will actually incentivize the work ethic, the actual practice of hard work. Okay, the conservatives assumed that for the great mass of workers, in order to incentivize the work ethic, workers would have to be in a state of permanent poverty and precarity, because they hypothesized a backward bending supply curve of labor, that workers just had a goal of reaching subsistence for themselves and their families. And if you paid them more, they would cut back on their effort because it would take less effort to reach subsistence. Whereas the workers' work ethic, promoted by Adam Smith, he has the classic forward bending supply curve of labor, right? If you want to make workers work harder, you pay them more, right? Because people have an interest in improving their material circumstances. So that's the first key dispute. The second key dispute has to do with what are the ultimate goals here, right? Why work for money beyond, you know, and basically in the capitalist work ethic, you work in order to show off your wealth. You have an ethic of conspicuous consumption and competitive emulation. People are competing with each other to show that they're better than other people, because look at all this wealth that they've accumulated. They're richer. So that's a sign that they're more virtuous and they should get, it's a kind of esteem competition. Whereas the workers' work ethic, nope. Right. We're not interested in just showing other people off. No, we need leisure at this point, right? Once we attain a certain level of prosperity, then it's time for us to be able to have the freedom to pursue other goals besides wealth accumulation. And that's really at the core of social democracy. Perhaps its greatest achievement, not achieved in the United States, but in some of the European countries, is guaranteed paid vacations and, you know, guaranteed paid family leaves and so forth. All right, so this more progressive work ethic, I think, leads directly to a critique of neoliberalism and what I think makes it ethically distinctive from, say, the dominant strands of egalitarian theorizing today, is that it's not just focused on the distribution of income and wealth. So if you look at a lot of egalitarian theorizing today, they're just obsessed with the distribution of income and wealth. Now, that's important, but going back and recovering the resources of the progressive work ethic helps us expand the agenda to a much broader critique of neoliberalism, beyond the concerns of distributive justice and the corresponding concerns with tax and welfare policies. So in particular, we get an independent critique of monopolies, private equity, other exploitative business models. They're not just objectionable because they produce a maldistribution of wealth. They're objectionable because they're actually creating predatory social relationships between people that are intrinsically objectionable, even if the state goes in there and redistributes the wealth and income back in a more fair way. We just don't want these business models to exist. So, for instance, at the core of private equity is a breach of trust between the business and all of the counterparties with whom that business interacts. Okay, like, you just don't want that. It's objectionable in itself. In addition, if we take Locke seriously and his foundational commitment to having a society in which not only does everyone flourish at the moment, but we also have the conditions for the reproduction of society where the next generation also flourishes, we can actually ground constraints on property rights based on intergenerational justice, and in particular with an environmental perspective. So unsustainable agricultural models are out, right? You can't have them, right? Because we need to have a sustainable system that can sustain intergenerational, justice and reproduction. I actually have a wonderful graduate student, Lingxi Chen Yang, who wrote a whole dissertation about this, connecting Lockean property theory to reforms we need for climate change. But it's coming straight out of this, the work ethic as Locke conceived of it. And again, additional concerns of this progressive work ethic that are distinct from a purely distributive agenda include objections to the authoritarianism of the workplace today, objections to precarious contracts, which leave people like 0 hours contracts where you don't know from week to week what your hours are going to be and have to scramble your whole off-duty life in order to accommodate whatever random hours you might be assigned by your employer. Objections to slavery, sweatshops, right? All kinds of oppressive modes of work and ways of organizing and governing work. And then as alternatives, modes of organizing work where workers have more autonomy, both individually and collectively. Collective bargaining, co-determination, maybe introducing corporate liability for decent labor standards in the global supply chains, all kinds of worker empowerment that could even be globalized, I think can come out of the progressive work ethic. So we have a whole range of concerns that I think go beyond a purely distributive agenda and focus more on the quality of social relationships that are established under neoliberalism, which is simply the latest version of the conservative work ethic, and focus on creating a more egalitarian set of relationships, which again harks back to the original Puritans who insisted on the equal dignity of all work and workers, regardless of their position in the division of labor. So there we have it.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I will begin with a rather general question about the whole project. In your book, you argue that the social and political changes for the better should focus on the decommodification of work. And this involves redefining the purpose of work from primarily supporting the market and large corporations to fostering the autonomous development of each individual and of the society as a whole. So given this context, how can you connect your views on the role of work ethic today with your understanding of democracy's epistemic function and its experimental nature in the pragmatic sense that you have elaborated on in recent years? In a nutshell, how do you conceive the interplay between economics and politics, or between market dynamics and democratic principles?
Yeah, so at the core of the work ethic is a desire to promote workers' autonomy. And that is both at the individual level, free choice of occupation, but also importantly at the collective level, promoting workers' participation in the governance of the firm and in designing the division of labor and workplace processes. Now, the critical issue here is that any exercise of collective autonomy, I think, is inherently experimental, right? Workers have a concept of what they'd like to achieve and, what kind of experience of work they would like. But, you could implement a revision of work processes, for instance, or the division of labor, and see whether you actually get what you wanted, right? I mean, it's experimental because you can't, you're making a hypothesis about how these arrangements will yield a certain quality of social relationships and experiences at work, but that could, we don't always anticipate correctly all of the effects of our social revisions. And so in a way, all that's happening here when we look at democracy's epistemic function is a kind of naturalization of Hegel's understanding of what collective autonomy amounts to, right? So Hegel thought, right, our wills are collectively expressed in a social order in which we can recognize and affirm ourselves in the resulting order established by the laws. Okay, but whether we can so recognize ourselves and our wills depends on the results, right? And we always have to ask ourselves, are the outcomes we've collectively produced something that we can collectively affirm? And I think in a way, Edward Bernstein is really the critical figure here. He's thinking in very similar terms to the way John Dewey thought about democracy in the United States as an essentially experimental mode of social organization, right? You got ideas in your head, you realize them in the world, and then you see whether what you've produced in the world is actually what you thought you were going to be doing, right? What you wanted originally, right? And there's a constant feedback loop then between realizing events in the world or products in the world and then getting feedback about whether those products are really what you wanted. It's that experimentalism in a democratic form conducted collectively.
In the chapter 2 of the book, you elaborate an alternative interpretation of Locke's works, portraying him as a proponent of the Protestant work ethic. Considering that Nozick's libertarian reading of Locke serves as the foundation for his development of a theory of justice, what implications might your reconstruction of Locke have for such a theory? For instance, thinking out loud, could it render Locke more compatible with John Rawls' conception of justice in this reading? And on the other hand, in this same chapter, you make reference to Locke's advice to make a differentiation between unjust actions and uncharitable ones. Quoting one passage, you said, while it is not unjust to charge the market price for food in an area struck by famine, it might offend against charity to do so. And if people die because one is not willing to sell at a price they can afford, one is guilty of murder. End of the quoting. What kind of normative implications would arise from this distinction? I'm thinking, for instance, in the differentiation between misfortunes and injustices, as well as moral harms and injustices. Furthermore, I reflect on Nozick's understanding of justice primarily as the application of principles rather than a focus on the outcomes. What critiques can be developed against this perspective, libertarian perspective, from the standpoint of the progressive work ethic?
Yeah, these are great questions. I think a critical flaw of libertarian approaches is that every assertion of a right entails a corresponding duty on other people to respect that right. Okay, and that means that all individual rights to liberty entail a sacrifice of liberties on the part of the duty bearers. Well, so you have a trade-off here. How do we decide what trade-offs are acceptable? Nozick is starting from the state of nature Okay. And remember, in Locke's original state of nature, there's no scarcity, right? Population is low. And so people could just like claim some land and it's not going to interfere. There's no costs on other people, right? As soon as the land is completely appropriated, which occurs with a combination of the invention of money and population growth, suddenly now the appropriation of land is imposing costs on other people. In particular, it's creating a class of very poor people who have no more access to land because it's all been appropriated. It also creates problems because now people's claims are abutting against each other, right? And so you get land use conflicts because my use of my land can negatively affect your use of your land. Okay, and that's why we need a state, right, to settle these problems. Now, Locke wisely understood that with the introduction of these conflicts, the trade-offs have changed, and consequently, the rights we're entitled to claim also have to change because the costs on duty bearers from being required to respect the original natural property rights, right, are much higher than before. And his mode of dealing with this is essentially contractualist, right? What you want to do, it's not purely utilitarian because every particular person has to have their needs for survival and flourishing respected. That's an outcome result, but it's not utilitarian in the contemporary sense because it doesn't allow you to just sacrifice whole classes of people because you're going to get a greater aggregate total welfare at the end, right? No, that's why he moves to a contractualist rationale, which requires some kind of unanimity. And that's, I think, the critical insight that Rawls drew from Locke. So yes, you need property rights, and that's fine, but they're going to be highly constrained and also variable depending on the actual empirical consequences of the way you divided up the property rights. And consequently, say now with climate change, which of course was not even imaginable in Locke's day, okay, and people took for granted in Locke's day, well, how else are you going to keep your house warm and cook and so forth other than by burning wood, right? Or other fossil fuels. Well, now we know, in fact, that that's not sustainable. We owe things to future generations. So, right, our rights change as a result.
Regard one of the main theoretical motivations of your book, namely the reincorporation of normative concerns within economic theory. In particular, for example, two thinkers typically conceived as classical liberals, as Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, are revealed in your book as advocates of a society that prioritizes general welfare over economic productivity. For example, for Mill, progress implies a society among equals in which the individual well-being of one subject does not detract from the well-being of another subject. And they have room to develop their human capabilities as they see fit, while obviously maintaining a material standard of living. So my question will be, against this background, in what sense do you consider and evaluate the relationship between politics and morality with economics throughout the history of the work ethics, and with respect to our current geopolitical situation? How does the structuring of this relationship between politics and economics, in particular in relation with the labor space, shows the moral foundation of a given society, again, obviously considering our globalized economy? So
yeah. One thing I want to stress, which is a very profound distinction between the normative field of classical economics and neoclassical economics, is the classical economists were overwhelmingly concerned with the idea that the economic system shouldn't just be evaluated by looking at what it produces in material terms, like the goods and services it produces, or the welfare effects of those goods and services on consumers. That's the neoclassical picture, right? We just look at consumer welfare. We assume that workers will be fully compensated by whatever they get from wages. Okay, so we don't even have to pay attention to that. If they're willing to work, we assume that they're compensated. Okay, and we don't look at things like the organization of labor within the firm. We don't look at things like the effects of different work regimes on what kind of people get produced by those work regimes. And we don't look at the relationships between people. That's the contemporary kind of narrow normative perspective of economics. But in the classical world, the classical economists assumed that by far the most important products of the economic system and the division of labor was people themselves and their social relationships, right? We're reproducing a whole form of society that has profound effects on the flourishing of the people within it. And we have to look at those effects specifically on workers. That is not just consumers. Right. And so that leads us to a very different normative world in which then we can raise important questions like, are workers stultified at work? Is their initiative and autonomy suppressed at work? Those are very live questions for the classical economists, starting with Smith, but also really deep questions for Mill and Marx. And one of the things that I stress is that really they're all on the same page. You know, Marx had radically different understandings of what institutional arrangements would be desirable if we cared about these issues. Okay, because he thought markets were bad and corrupting, whereas Smith and Mill are much more hopeful for the ability of market exchange to actually promote equal relations between people. And you know, and they thought also a great difference from today's neoclassical regime that you might require, they're market friendly, but they're also very friendly to radical changes in property ownership. Much more aggressive about changing the property regime. So what they do is attribute defects with the output of market systems, not to markets, but actually to ownership. So you have to abolish, you know, slavery, debt peonage, right? All kinds of oppressive labor systems in order to liberate workers. And ideally in Mill's system, move to worker cooperatives away from traditional capitalist managed firms. But once you have them, then, you know, you let the markets run. People are more or less equal under this system, so you can trust the outcomes.
In his most recent book, Axel Honneth presents a perspective on work as an activity essential for maintaining forms of life. In contrast, drawing from the Puritan work ethic, you seem to advocate for the value of work as a means for the full development of individuals. Additionally, in reference to Amartya Sen, you support an institutional framework that ensures the realization of various capabilities. Do you believe that your approach has a more agential aspect, emphasizing the individual, compared to Honneth's interpretation, which is more aligned with the social importance of work? Furthermore, how do you see both viewpoints being reconciled while also addressing potential criticisms of moral perfectionism?
Yeah, So I actually don't see Hannah and I as being all that much in disagreement. So if we go back to the original Puritan conception of what ideal or meaningful work would look like, it's disciplined activity that contributes to the benefit of other people, primarily the consumers of goods and services produced by the worker, but where the actual activity of production also enhances the life of the worker, right? By enabling the worker to exercise autonomy and initiative at work, either both individually and collectively, and by exercising skills that, you know, they enjoy exercising. So there's really a unity in this picture between individual autonomy, collective autonomy of workers as such, but also the embeddedness of work in a larger social system where even what counts as work, as legitimate work, has to be promoting the welfare of people outside the firm, right? Whoever is consuming the goods and services in question. You know, I'm a believer in workplace democracy. Okay, and so workers do have the autonomy, on my view, to make certain trade-offs. And I am, so, you know, it's not like I'm requiring workers to adopt a perfectionist mode of organizing the work processes. And in fact, if we look empirically at the very interesting work by Isabel Ferraris, she went out and interviewed low-wage workers, in particular retail cashiers, and asked them what they cared about. Number one, even more than decent wages, was just being respected for the jobs that they do, right? I mean, being recognized as doing essential labor, being respected for that, both by the customers immediately and by the broader society. And that, say, the exercise of desirable skills, they ranked lower than that. Well, you know, if workers have greater voice in the firm, they have the right to make those trade-offs. At the same time, I would also want to point out that if we look at worker cooperatives, a very common mode of organizing worker cooperatives is rotation of positions, right? That is, people will rotate through different jobs within the firm, and I think that it both solves a collective action problem that has to do with differential pay, right? If everybody rotates through, then everybody can claim more or less equal shares of firm revenues. But the other aspect to this is that you're exercising a variety of skills, and it tends to make the work more interesting. Right. And also just gives people a fuller view and appreciation of what everybody else is doing within the cooperative. So I'm inclined to think that the more autonomy, you know, the more fully workers are in control of work processes, the more likely they are to divide them equally and reduce the drudgery being consigned to a micro division of labor that consigns them to tedious drudgery. There are other ways to organize work.
Thank you.
Professor Anderson, One of the counterexamples that shows how difference between the rich and the poor are more due to the market conditions and political institutions than to personal merit is the figure of the laboring poor. Despite their efforts and long working hours, they do not escape poverty because certain conditions, some procedures, for example, accidents, health issues, pandemics, etc., and others are structural, such as market conditions, the evaluation of certain jobs, and the minimum wage, and so forth. In this sense, for workers to take back the work ethic in their favor, they will need to change these structural conditions. Will this necessarily imply a revaluation of wage labor that challenge the prejudices upon which the hierarchy of labor is based? For example, hierarchy in professional versus non-professional jobs.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Given that there are highly paid professional jobs that are not necessary, as identified by Greber, while other non-professional occupations are poorly paid despite being absolutely essential, as demonstrated during the pandemic. Should we also consider reevaluating invisible work, such as domestic labor, or should this type of work be compensated?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot going on in your question. So one thing has to do with the very persistent attempts to justify radically unequal pay in the workplace on grounds of like skill. Oh, these are much scarce skills and so forth. It's so the stigmatization of so-called unskilled work is a rationale for poorly paid work. But in fact, if anything, if you look at attempts to mechanize this work, you see that in fact there's enormous skills involved. Or even apart from, say, trying to create robots that could, say, pick berries or fruits without crushing them. It's actually a very technically difficult thing. But even leaving that aside, we can see what happened in the UK when under the pandemic, they couldn't import workers to pick the fruits and vegetables. And they tried to recruit British workers to this. And they discovered that British workers, like, they hadn't been picking fruit, right? There's those skills have long since been lost to the British population. And they were terrible at it. They were ruining the berries, picking them like, you know, before they're ripe or crushing them and so forth. There's genuine skills here, even in what we stigmatize, right? And the same thing goes for nurses, aides, home care workers, and so forth. There's enormous skills involved that's just not appreciated. So I think there's a lot of ideology that's very oppressive that goes into these distinctions. And then at the high end, I always go back to Baxter's quote about the prison and the calamity of, you know, being very busy extracting wealth from other people without actually contributing to social welfare. And, you know, if we look at professional occupations that do that, 80% of finance and financial transactions are just zero-sum games. They're just playing financial games, trading, creating new asset classes, derivatives, and so forth. None of this adds value to the economy. Mostly it's very clever ways to extract income by increasing the costs of financial transactions, taking advantage of financially naive people who need to borrow money and don't understand these complicated contracts. There's an awful lot of scamming that goes on. And of course, a lot of this financial activity leads ultimately to financial instability in the global economy, as we saw in the Great Recession of 2007 to 9. Right. This is all negative value-added activity. I think we should definitely dramatically cut back on the number of financial jobs at the professional level, financial engineers and so forth. None of it is doing anything of any value to the real economy. And similar for consultants. We already know now from scandals at McKinsey and other leading consultancies how predatory their advice is and destructive, right? Most of that should also just be eliminated. So I agree with you entirely. I mean, it's not just that this is bullshit work in the sense of really just spinning your wheels and doing nothing. It's actively harmful to society. Oh, and then also about domestic labor within the household. Yes. Obviously, I think we do need to recognize that work is socially necessary. I think I do think there is a case to be made for compensating it. There are many ways in which this could be done. Other people think that technology could at least eliminate a lot of housework. So now we have robot vacuum cleaners and so forth. I'm not sure that that is generalizable. If we look actually at the history of domestic cleaning technology, there's a great history of this. It's a little bit old, but I don't think things have changed that much. Ruth Cowan wrote a book in the 1980s called More Work for Mother. Everyone predicted you have the washing machine, right? That this is going to, right, relieve women of a lot of housework. Because back in the day, laundry day was enormously labor intensive. Now you just throw stuff in the washing machine, right? But in fact, what Cowan discovered empirically was that the introduction of purportedly labor-saving technology in the household, all it did was raise standards of cleanliness, right? And so women didn't actually spend less time doing housework because now they were expected to meet a higher standard of cleanliness. And it's ironic, but of course we already have John Stuart Mill said the same thing about the introduction of machinery in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, the mid-19th century, when everything's getting mechanized. And he lamented that the introduction of all this machinery hadn't relieved workers of, you know, a single hour of tedious drudgery. If anything, they were made to work even harder and more intensively with all this machinery. So I'm less optimistic that technology will be the solution to our problems in the domestic sphere. And on top of that, of course, this doesn't deal with child rearing, which I think is a much more important aspect of domestic labor. And here I just want to stress that despite what the tech bros want to push on us, screens are no substitute for active relationship building with one's children. And if anything, what we need is more freedom for anyone taking on a parental role to take time off of work and build those relationships with the kids that they're raising.
Professor Anderson, I would like to elaborate a little bit on the grounds of Gina's question. A recurring topic throughout your book is the distinction between productive work and being busy. You have already mentioned this in the previous question. In a world where there is certain, we would say, anxiety about leisure and everybody wants to be busy all the time, what kind of implications might the category of genuinely productive work have? Would it let us, for example, to propose some utopian models of society in which the natural abilities of each person are used to obtain greater social benefit? You discussed a little bit this stuff in some passages related to Marx, but I would really like to know your opinion.
Yeah, so I have a kind of different response coming from the United States than, say, if we look at things from the standpoint of many European social democracies. And the difference is the United States really is much more work obsessed. Americans work more hours, take far less vacation. I think Americans are extremely time poor, and Americans tend to feel guilty about not being busy enough. I even see this in my own students. So University of Michigan, it's a selective school, which really what it means is when there's competitive admissions, it's actually just functions as a class selector. So I'm not endorsing it. Right, but basically my students are predominantly the children of the professional managerial class, which means that they don't have to be earning a wage, right? Their parents are giving them, they're paying for everything. But I taught a course on work to my undergraduates a couple of years ago, and I just asked for a show of hands how many people are working for a wage during the semester. Of course, in the summers, they're working at internships and prestigious kinds of work that prepare them for, you know, entry into the professional managerial class at elite corporations and so forth. But during the term, there's no need for them to work. And frankly, I would prefer if they didn't work for a wage. I'd much rather have them cracking the books, right? Actually reading the assignments. And virtually everybody raised their hand. They were working, you know, as a barista at a coffee shop. And so even though these are very financially well-off students, they don't have to be working, and they acknowledge that in a material sense, earning a wage was not necessary. Why were they doing it? Because they felt guilty if they didn't work for a wage. And that's actually a shift in the ethos of young people in America, which was excellently documented. It started in the 90s, I think. Annette Lareau has a wonderful book called Unequal Childhoods, in which she empirically investigated the child rearing styles of the professional managerial class versus the working class and poor. And what they found was the working class and poor let their kids run off and like play, right? And the kids exercise a lot of autonomy because they weren't under the supervision of adults on some structured activity that was intended to improve their talents and skills. Whereas a professional managerial class, the parenting style is very micromanaging. And so the kids are constantly enrolled in sports teams, music lessons, dance lessons. Like every minute is scheduled, and the kids have no leisure at all. And they've acquired that and internalized that idea that somehow if they're not busy improving themselves or earning a wage or something, that that there's something wrong with that. So for Americans, I think there's a great leisure deficit and a great failure to recognize how important leisure is for a flourishing life, and just for just having autonomy. These students are driven, and they're always under some set of rules, normally not imposed by themselves, but imposed by other people. Whereas in Europe, I think, right, we actually have a full and rich appreciation. People know how to enjoy their leisure in Europe, and they have a lot of it. Right, and that's really one of the great achievements of social democracy in Europe. So I think, yeah, so I'm in favor of more leisure for Americans, and I'll let the Europeans figure out whether they have their work-life balance figured out.
So in its historical reconstruction, your book posits a common thread between the logic, methods, and values of the conservative ethics that emerged at Great Britain in the 19th century in the form of an ideology and the main assumptions of contemporary neoliberal economics. It identifies a fundamental operation in some kind of rationalization of social and political ideals and their associated institutions, which obliterates internal contradictions between values, beliefs, practices of the subjects, and interferes with the grasp of empirical reality. Your text explains how through these rationalizations, ideology gets its own feedback, generating its own internal coherence. I wonder if you could explore a little deeper in this ideological operation. And in this line, I wonder how the progressive tradition has diverted falling for these forms of rationalizations and avoided these contradictions. In other words, is it possible to establish a criteria that allow us to identify the progressive approach as intrinsically free of ideological reasoning, whether at the level of explanations or at the level of public policies?
Well, the term ideology has two senses in English. We have a pejorative sense, right, where ideological reasoning essentially depends on a false or misleading model of our social world and its possibilities. So in this sense, ideological reasoning, say, cuts out of consideration certain possibilities that are represented as impossible, right? They underestimate the feasibility of certain alternatives, or they say offer a very narrow and limited view of the terms in which we should evaluate social arrangements that excludes many normatively relevant ways of evaluating it. So I mentioned in particular this economist's notion of compensation, which assumes that if you accept some horrible job just to survive, then you'd be fully compensated for all of the risks and burdens imposed on you. I think that's a very ideological conception of compensation in the pejorative sense. But then there's a larger non-pejorative sense of ideology, which is just a kind of representation of the social world and the possibilities open to us for reorganizing that social world, which are cast in, normatively freighted terms. And that non-pejorative sense, which is consistent with having, not misrepresenting our social world and its possibilities, is inescapable, right? I mean, we need such representations in order to guide democratic deliberation, any kind of normative ideals. Now, at the same time, I want to stress that such ideological representations, it's not pejorative, but it's open to revision, right? I mean, that's really the essence of democratic experimentation. We have some idea about how to make the world better. We put it into practice. People experience what life is like under those conditions, okay? Or what life is like according to when it operates according to certain principles. And we learn things from this. And sometimes we learn that the normative categories we used maybe are missing something that's important. So we might even revise our normative ideas. And that's just part of, a standard pragmatist picture of how we learn from experience how to improve our normative ideas. I wouldn't call that, there's a difference between ideology in the pejorative sense, which is stubbornly resistant to already imagined possibilities or trying to cut off the possibility of imagining certain things and just being mistaken or partial or not quite getting the full picture, which of course is inherent in everything, but right, but not a priori objectionable. It's the same in science, right? I mean, even the best scientific theories today haven't solved every problem, right? And further deployment of scientific tools leads to refinement of those tools, right? And sometimes even dramatic paradigm changes. That's just part of normal things, and it's the only way we have of improving ourselves and our ideas.
Thank you for your answers, Professor Anderson. I will ask the following question. Through the book, various means by which conservative work ethics shaped common sense through the imposition of public policies are presented. Chapter 7 presents Marx's proposals on how to change that order. Would Marx's revolutionary approach necessarily be incapable of paving the way for a democratic period? In an authoritarian environment ideologically inclined towards the concentration of wealth in a few hands, how could a gradual change proposal like Mill's prosper?
Yeah, so I do think that, in my chapter on Marx, I point out the contradiction between his revolutionary rhetoric and his actual social practice after 1848. Right, he was a revolutionary in the 1848 revolution, but after that, he was actually, in practical terms, what the activism that he did in Britain was very reformist. It's about building labor union power. His last significant political act was to call for workers to organize social democratic parties, right? It actually is trending in a democratic direction. And I think that's a positive development, because what we learned from the communist revolutions is when you take over the state violently and kill off your enemies, which of course, that was Marx's revolutionary theory, that what made, his model of revolution was always, let's do the French Revolution well. and Robespierre's key mistake was he didn't kill off his enemies quick enough. Right. Well, okay. Well, then you're going to have like mass bloodshed. And in reality, what happens is the most ruthless megalomaniacs take over. Right. And we've just seen that time and time again with violent revolution. So it's an extremely risky proposition to go the revolutionary path. Because the kinds of people who get selected for leadership tend themselves to be people who think they know everything and are willing to use ruthless and violent means to impose that vision on everybody else. You often get very unhappy results, as we've seen from the history. So that's a major reason why I prefer democratic approaches to social reforms. Now, that does, of course, raise the problem that contemporary democratic orders are now struggling under conditions of extreme inequality of income and wealth, which have led to the overweening power of the super rich and top CEOs of major corporations who have disproportionate influence, to say the least, on policymaking. And that's a global problem because the super rich have designed the international global order of trade and finance, basically in ways that enrich themselves, especially at the expense of less wealthy countries. I'll just point to one feature in particular, although there are many problems with the international economic order, but one big problem is the free trade system, so-called free trade system, enables corporations to lodge complaints, lawsuits against countries that interfere with their profit model, even by means of things like environmental regulations and labor regulations to improve the conditions of work. And they can sue these countries and impose draconian fines in private secret arbitration, which nobody gets to investigate because it's all in secret, and basically stop labor reform and environmental reform in these countries. It's obviously oppressive. It's just plutocracy. It's fundamentally contrary to a democratic system. Right, this all has to be dismantled. Right, I think the rules of the World Trade Organization are inherently oppressive and never should have been adopted in the form that they were. But in a way, I also see the WTO rules as already being undermined, ironically, by the United States, which originally imposed these rules, but now the United States is recognizing that these rules aren't even good for America. So the United States actually, through its own powers, has been undermining the ability of the WTO to function. And that it's not good for a global rule of law. But I think it is it portends some fundamental changes in the global trading system that might actually hold promise, because everybody can see that the current system isn't working.
In your book, the question of desert for one situations come to the fore at different points. In that sense, one could say that the advocates of the conservative work ethic want to firmly and ideologically tie work to desert and the material rewards one receives. Meanwhile, the advocates of the progressive work ethic rather see work as a space in which not only material production is realized, but which enables human fulfillment. So in each case, what we deserve is radically different. So my question would be, to what extent and in what way, if at all, would it be feasible to eradicate the notion of material desert to the fruits of labor from the workplace? So, yeah.
Yeah. Advocates of the progressive work ethic have really, almost from the beginning, criticized the idea that market returns have much to do with what people deserve. And in fact, it goes back to this wonderful, the critique goes back to this wonderful analogy to the division of labor that Robert Sanderson made, the great Puritan theologian. Sanderson compared the division of labor in society to the gears and springs in a clock. Okay. And on the one hand, what he's saying is when you have a good division of labor, just like with a clock, if a well-designed clock, it will tell the time accurately, right? It does give you a good outcome. But he also pointed out that every gear and spring is like helping every other gear move along, right? To produce this collective outcome. Everybody's helping everybody else, right? Regardless of whether it's a big gear or a little gear, right? It's all of us working together to produce this good outcome. But once you think in those terms, it becomes impossible to understand desert in terms of my particular productive contribution to the whole. How many seconds does the tiny gear, can you attribute, as the clock tells time, can you attribute a particular number of seconds that any particular gear advances? Of course not, right? It's only all the gears working together produce the whole product together. You can't divide that up into the marginal productivity of each individual gear. It's just incoherent question. And in the history of the progressive work ethic, you have this argument made again and again. William Thompson, the great Ricardian socialist, made this point. And not only him, I mean, it just comes up again and again. Once you understand how the division of labor works, nobody's entitled to claim any particular chunk of output as their unique contribution. What makes you productive is the fact that everybody else standing behind you in the division of labor is enhancing your productivity, right? And in fact, that's a point that John Rawls also makes, only in passing, unfortunately. I wish he had spent more time on it. So desert is just hopeless. And another reason to understand how hopeless it is this wonderful recent work, which I'm trying to look him up here. Let me see if I can find it. I can't find it, but there's this great work by a recent political economist who looked at the division of profits across corporations in the world. So there's a great inequality of profits, globally speaking, across all firms. Okay, so only like the top, I don't know, 500 or 1,000 firms in the world globally essentially make all the profits. Like the vast majority of small enterprises are at the absolute margin of subsistence. They're making almost zero profits. Right. It's all being collected by, you know, Apple, Google, the huge tech firms, the big banks, you know, the financial firms, a handful of private equity companies. And what enables them to make profits? Basically, what this guy figured out is it's patents. Patents are in other words, it's the intellectual property regime that's establishing monopolies. That's what's doing all the work. Now, you know, there's a role for intellectual property. Oh, here's the guy's name. It's Herman Mark Schwartz is the political economist who figured this out. Profits are the core, you know, it's monopoly profits from patents that are generating essentially all the profits that there are. And that, you know, raises a serious question. I'm not going to say that we should abolish patents, but I think it raises serious questions when you have that gross inequality. And most of the unequal wages come about from the fact that employees at the most profitable firms make wages vastly higher than what's possible in any other firm. So if you're employed, say, in a top 500 firm globally, you're just going to have much higher wages, not because you personally invented the profit, but just because you're lucky enough to get a job at a firm that holds a lot of patents. So again, it just undermines the whole desert theory.
I would like to return to some of the topics discussed before about leisure and technology, but linked with patents. Smith criticized the conservative work ethic defense of the monotony of labor, which consider it an ascetic discipline, thereby rejecting all kinds of innovation as a tendency towards laziness. For Smith, this discourages innovation, which ultimately leads to improved productivity, and in turn to prosperity and leisure for all. However, does this trust in technology not obscure the historical experience of the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent labor crisis with its impoverishment and precariousness, that is, the appropriation of technological innovation, ultimately puts the worker in a vulnerable position, making them dispensable and therefore worse paid, while those who own the technology in the form of patents, for example, reap the economic benefits. Thus, while it may produce prosperity in leisure, it does not do so for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think we would have to drill down to the particulars of particular patents and technologies, but I just want to stress one place where this is coming out is with the tech platforms for gig work. So like Uber, TaskRabbit, there's a kind of ideology that is promoted to workers that now you can be self-employed, right? You can operate your own car and ride, drive people. But in fact, I've had many Uber drivers and I talk to them about what their work conditions are like. And what they tell me is that they entice you onto the platform by giving you extraordinarily great deals. And then once you're locked into that platform and maybe have given up your regular wage job, then you're trapped. And then they tweak the algorithm so that the only way to keep making money is to accept less profitable rides, and they take a larger and larger percentage of the share of the total fare. And so over time, you get attracted to it because at first, for the first 6 months or so, you're making great money. But it's all a trap because they can always change the algorithm, which can be individually tailored to you personally, right? And so everybody's facing different compensation, all the drivers. It's a very opaque system. And it's basically algorithmically designed to force workers into a position where in the end, it's no longer profitable for them, but they're trapped because now they quit their regular paid job because at first they were making so much money, but now it's harder to get back into their old job, right? And so there's a lot of this kind of manipulation going on the tech platforms. And I think the only solution to this is what Ireland adopted. They basically banned Uber, and the platforms are owned by the taxi drivers collectively. And in that way, right, I mean, if the workers themselves are on the tech platform, they're not going to permit algorithms that are going to ruin them, right? And they'll be able to, get a share of the profits from the technology itself.
Your book explores the processes by which the worker were commodified. But Marx pointed out that what is alienated in the capitalist market is the force of labor, which relationally give rise to value. Does this imply that Marx would necessarily be against the market in general, or instead against the way things are valued in the capitalist market?
Yeah, I do think Marx really thought that markets themselves were morally corrupting because they made people selfish. And, I think that was a deep part of socialism for a long time, deep suspicion of market exchange. But more recently, basically since the fall of the communist regimes in the post-Cold War era, right, in Eastern Europe, right, that was really a sign to socialist theorists to rethink the market. So you get the rise of market socialism. I mean, there were various market socialist ideas that had always been part of the socialist tradition, but a reevaluation of the market really took place at a foundational level in socialist theory because of the manifest failures of explicitly anti-market, centrally planned economies. It didn't work out as people thought they would. They're very disappointing outcomes. But one of the important findings of market socialism and the rethinking of markets has really been advanced by Sam Bowles. Do you know Sam Bowles? A very influential socialist, radical political economist, who recently wrote a very important book. And I'm gonna give the title to you. Let me see if I can find it here. The Moral Economy. It's a 2016 book, so it's 8 years old. But in it, he does a fundamental reassessment of the market. And it's based on some game theoretic experiments that he conducted with his collaborators in countries all over the world. And, there are various game theoretic experiments that look at things like public good games, public goods game where it models people's willingness to contribute to public goods in a laboratory setting. Everyone is initially allocated a certain number of dollars. And then if they voluntarily contribute to a common pot, if enough people contribute, then the pot will double, and then they can distribute the gains back according to certain rules. So, but you'll get the gain whether you contribute or not. And the question is, will enough people reach the threshold to contribute? And there are many other games like this that are which are trying to test, do people have norms of fairness? Do they have norms of public spirited contribution and so forth? And empirically, what was found was that individuals who live in economies that are founded on large-scale markets contribute more. They trust each other more, to do the right thing, to be cooperative, to be fair. And Bowles doesn't think that it's markets alone that achieve this, but rather markets and liberal societies that impose a kind of systematic rule of law that make markets more honest, right? That you have recourse if somebody cheats you on the market. But markets are still playing a role. And I think Bowles's work is really critical to reevaluating markets and making them not the fundamental promoters of selfishness as Marx thought. I think that's just empirically wrong. I mean, some markets can, right? If they're just like systematically predatory, but markets, with liberal regimes under a strong rule of law can promote social trust. And that I think that's just empirical. And so that's an important part of the turn of socialist theorists towards market socialism and a focus more on issues such as distribution of income and wealth, firm governance, embedding markets in democracy and what it takes to have a more democratic society. Those are now higher priorities in socialist thinking these days than like attacks on the market as such.
So your book offers a theoretical and normative framework for claiming a tradition that, starting from the workers, reforms the meaning of work in our societies. My first question is related to the previous issues, I think. That is, what could be the place in your approach for alternatives such as the questioning of liberal property regimes, or nowadays the proposal for a universal income? And my second question is about the kind of subjectivity we encounter and what kind of interests are present in today working class. I am thinking about how the ideal of self-employment seems to have taken hold, the idea of being able to become your own boss is successfully advertised and has become the aspiration, I think, of many of the working class.
So as far as reforming property and wealth distribution goes, I think it's very, there are two separate concerns. One is raising the bottom, and the other is limiting the top. And Ingrid Robbins, important philosopher of economics in the Netherlands, has this book on limitarianism, in which she advocates limiting the top amount of wealth that people can have. I can't remember what her number is. I think she thinks people should max out at $10 million US. And there are many reasons for this, but one is basically to undermine plutocracy. Right, if you have extreme wealth inequality, then the super rich just take over. And that's been a concern in democratic theory, at least since Rousseau, if not earlier. Now, Robbins herself ties limits to the top to opening up resources that could then be redistributed to the bottom, perhaps through a universal basic income. I myself am I'm a little bit ambivalent about a universal basic income. I'm very enthusiastic about limiting the top, right? And that, of course, is also a key concern of John Rawls, who is my advisor. He links this to the fair value of political liberties, right? It's the classic Rousseau argument. You have super rich people who vastly exceed the wealth of everybody else, and de facto, they can control politics. It's just, and we've seen that with the explosion of inequality in the United States. The super rich just have way too much power in the political order. At the bottom, I have some concerns about universal basic income as the basic mode of establishing welfare. I could see the reasons for it. But there's actually great inequalities in the question is, there's a limited amount of room for the state to, fiscal space for them to establish a redistributive regime. And it's not obvious to me that equal incomes at the universal equilibrium, equal incomes is going to be the best use of public funds. It could be we want a different way of redistributing those funds, and in particular, the provision of community-based goods, things like one thing a UBI will never achieve is affordable housing. Okay, it's just not enough. So maybe more publicly funded housing, for instance. I mean, I just think that there's a lot of things that need to be done for people. And it's not obvious that individual distributions are going to do it for them. Healthcare is another thing. You just have to have, a different system, because even if everybody gets $300 a month, a really expensive healthcare procedure could just kill them financially anyway. So you just need a different system for healthcare, for financing healthcare. There's a lot of things like this, and what the ultimate configuration of social welfare benefits looks like, how much room there will be left over for a universal basic income, I think is an open question. It will depend a lot on the details of any particular society and what its economy looks like. So we have extremely positive outcomes, say, from basic income programs targeted specifically to the poor, so they're not strictly universal, in places like Brazil, which in fact are ridiculously cheap to operate. In the United States, to lift everybody out of poverty, that's like a very substantial amount of funds that would be coming out of other public needs. It's not clear it's optimal, actually, for the rich countries. There are other ways to lift people out of poverty by making fundamental goods publicly provided, rather than just dicing it up into monthly income allocations individually.
I think there was another question I proposed about the self-employment or...
Oh, self-employment, right, yes. So this gets us back to the question of gig labor and who owns the platforms. I think self-employment does have a lot of attractions. You're running your own work life. You choose your own hours in principle. But in reality, with the gig platforms being run by these technology corporations, you have a lot less autonomy than you think, because they rig the algorithm to force you into certain patterns of work, which often become like just as crushing a pace and just as exploitative as the traditional assembly line. So I think what we have to recognize is that self-employment, while it's potentially attractive, needs workers to control the platforms, or else they're just going to get exploited.
According to your reading, John Stuart Mill proposed cooperatives as an overcoming of Smith's dilemmas between the production enhancement of the Industrial Revolution and the individual flourishing of all workers. So with cooperative, it is in the enhancements of production that the individual flourishing of all is promoted. So it is in the democratization of the workspace through cooperatives that this normative insight is instantiated. So my questions will be, how would it be feasible to incorporate the cooperative model in an economy as globalized as ours? Specifically, how can spaces be created, whether cooperative or other organizational forms that promote the democratization of labor? So I'm thinking of companies that have presence all around the world. How can we instantiate a cooperative model or democratize this labor space?
That's really a great question. I think global corporations need to be held responsible for their supply chains. Because right now, what happens, and this gets back to the unequal distribution of profits across enterprises, is that the leading global corporations have shrunk down basically to around their patents, and a small number of extremely highly compensated professional, managerial, and technical workers who are focused on inventing new patents, like in the tech companies, and marketing and branding and finance. Okay, and all the other work is outsourced to other firms with which there's a tight contractual relationship. So the classic example of this model would be Apple. Okay, Apple doesn't make any of its own stuff, right? The iPhone, all of the actual manufacturing is, the assembly happens mostly in China of the iPhone. All of the components are coming from other firms that manufacture, the glass for the iPhone screen, the chips, all various components inside, right? So Apple, in fact, isn't doing any of the manufacturing. They own the patents, the intellectual property, which is monopoly. They do the branding. They have their technical workers who are doing the design work. They designed the iPhone. right? But they're not actually making it. Why? Because what they're doing is they've shrunk the firm around just that work that is right generating the profits because of the way our intellectual property system works. But you can, this is really just a feature of the law, right? You can change the laws to make the leading firms responsible and joint employers with whatever firms are actually doing the manufacturing. And what we see, what we know empirically is that, just give you an example, they've done this study about sweatshop workers, I believe in El Salvador, who are engaged in garment, producing like men's shirts, okay, for rich countries, consumers in rich countries. And it turns out that you could literally double the wages of the Salvadorian workers who are actually creating these shirts. You could double their wages, which would be a life-transforming alteration of their circumstances. And the ultimate cost to the consumer would be like 25 US cents per shirt. In other words, it's beneath notice. Right? Like most consumers, they wouldn't even notice a difference of 25 cents in the price of a shirt, of a men's shirt. Okay. Whereas that minor redistribution of income would be absolutely life transforming for the poor workers who are doing all the work. Okay. And it's that dramatic inequality, right? Where you could dramatically improve the lives of these workers for a loss to rich country consumers that they wouldn't even notice. It's so small, right? And really, you have to change the relationships between the leading firms and their supply chains. And it's really a legal question, but it's certainly possible. But it's also a managerial question. So there's a very important researcher. His name is Richard Locke. Same as John Locke, that's right, L-O-C-K-E. He's no relation, but he's a researcher. He's an economist at the Sloan School of Business at MIT, who's done very important work on improving conditions for work in global supply chains. This is empirical work. And what he discovered is in a lot of poor countries, the managers in the supply chains in these local factories just have no management skills. And so they end up doing things that are very abusive to the workers. Like maybe they are engaged in violence against workers who aren't making quota. And it's really appalling what they're doing. But in fact, what he showed was, modern management theory does not tell you that beating up workers is a good way to improve productivity. It's a very bad way, not just inherently, morally, but it actually doesn't even improve productivity. So let me give you some important research by him. I'm going to put it in chat. Where you can, let's just see here. I'm just going to give you, now this is really strange. Oh, here we go. This is a beautiful piece. I'm just going to put it in chat for you. it's based on his own empirical work about how you can make workers way better off and even more productive by giving them more autonomy at work. And giving them a voice in how to arrange the production, arrange like work processes within the firm. It's quite impressive empirical research. So there's a lot we can do, even at the global level, just by making firms responsible for training the managers in their supply chain. Just making them better managers based on modern management theory.
So chapter 7 concludes with Marx's call to participate in institutional politics through political parties. What kind of characteristics and practices should a political party have today that seriously seeks to challenge the institution of the conservative work ethic, considering the rejection of the workers themselves of practices like rest or the evolution of the workday?
Yeah, you point to something that I think is quite distressing about modern social democracy. And that is that we see in things like the Hartz reforms in Germany. I mean, Germany was once like the leading social democratic, place, or one of the leading places outside of the Scandinavian countries. But in fact, social democracy in Europe has become much more tied to the conservative work ethic. And in a way, what Hijacked is trying to explain is that because of the two sides of the work ethic, there's almost nobody in my history who completely made a clean break from the conservative work ethic. In fact, ironically, given his public reputation, the only advocate of the progressive work ethic who I consider completely free of any vestige of the conservative work ethic is Adam Smith. I mean, even Edward Bernstein, he was on board European imperialism. Now, of course, that's due to the whole Marxist influence, right? If you believe that every country has to go through the capitalist stage before being ready to move on to socialism, like one thing that capitalism does is nudge all of the global South onto force the global South to adopt a capitalist model. And if you think that, going through that is necessary, then you can't even, then like imperialism is okay. Right. And so even Bernstein, right. And in fact, in evolutionary socialism, he even endorses what he calls Manchesterism. Right. The Manchester School of Economic Thought in the 19th century, very conservative work ethic, laissez-faire. Smith was the only guy who didn't give even one iota to any of that. And I think it's largely because he wrote before Malthus. Malthus, the influence of Malthus on work ethic thinking, it's impossible to exaggerate. And it's deeply linked to population panic, panic over purportedly lazy workers. Right, and that's been with us ever since. And a population panic, of course, has for a long time driven the relationship of the rich countries to the developing world. And now it's manifested in a somewhat different way from back in the 60s and 70s. Now it's connected to panic over immigration, because there's not a single rich country in the world that is actually reproducing its population just on the basis of the fertility of its own citizens. Right. The United States still has a growing population, but that's entirely due to immigration. And same for other rich countries that still have a growing population. it's all due to immigration. So it's kind of panic over foreigners coming in, and a panic over social reproduction as a result. So it's still population panic. It's somewhat different from Malthus, but right, similar kinds of sentiments involved.
Professor Anderson, I would like to propose a general overview between conservative and progressive perspective. Can it be argued that from a conservative work ethic perspective, there is a hierarchy between the work sphere and the social sphere, where expectations from one are imposed on the other, whereas in a progressive work ethic, the opposite occurs? For conservatives, there is a reluctance to provide income to those in poverty who cannot work, whether temporarily, for example, infants, those with medical conditions, primary caregivers, or permanently, for example, those with severe disabilities. Solidarity or social assistance can keep these groups dependent on either compassion or bureaucracy. On the other hand, Ricardian socialists, Bray and Thompson, proposed communal living arrangements as an alternative granting autonomy to these groups. Does this propose a moral obligation to workers towards society, shifting the hierarchy so the work sphere derives its meaning from the social sphere?
So you raise a really, really interesting observation here. Yes, so you have these socialists who think we should all be living in a commune, and then we can share out the work of dependent care for people who are either temporarily dependent because of their children, or maybe even permanently, if they're permanently disabled. But in fact, there are many disadvantages to communal living. You have to coordinate your behavior with so many other people. The more people in your household or your living space, the more adjustments you have to make, the less privacy you have. It turns out not to be a very attractive model for a lot of people, especially if they're introverted. Right. But in fact, the idea that we have to, provide for people unable to work through a kind of shared living space. There are other alternatives. And there's a wonderful book that's going to be coming out. I've read it in manuscript by Fred Bloch. I don't know if you know Bloch. He's a very important political economist in the Karl Polanyi tradition. And Bloch is taking advantage of an important insight of modern monetary theorists. And basically, the key insight of modern monetary theory is that states are currency issuers. They issue currency, right? And so you shouldn't consider them as borrowers. Even when they issue bonds, it's not borrowing in the same sense as a consumer that borrows money or a firm that borrows money and has to pay it back. That, in fact, under conditions of economic growth, you have to constantly issue new currency in order to keep growing the economy. And then the question is, how does money creation happen? Well, in current capitalist economies, the vast majority of money creation is undertaken by private commercial banks. Right? A commercial bank will take a deposit of $100 and then loan out $1,000 if they have a 10% reserve requirement. They'll loan out $1,000 to a borrower. Okay, they've just created $900 out of thin air. What Bloch observes is that what's happened here is that the state has essentially turned these banks into franchises of the state. Franchise, it's like McDonald's doesn't own its burger places. You have a franchise, a franchisee who actually runs the local burger store, right? And they get branding, right? And certain management techniques from the central. And the way banking works that way. But he says, why should we exclusively franchise things to commercial banks? Why don't we allow community organizations that might be devoted to all kinds of nonprofit work, including, importantly, care work, and let them, in a way, issue currency that they then consume, right, through that. That is the, like a town could decide to that they'll have some currency creation power that they can use to fund nonprofits to help with dependent care work, whose function is to share in the work of taking care of people who are disabled and permanently dependent or even temporarily dependent. And that way you don't have to all live in the same space. Right? There are other ways to share this out just by taking advantage of the nature of money and currency issuing.
So my last question is about, I think about the antagonism. The two ways of understanding the work ethic, conservative and progressive, are related to a class division, like you point out. How can we rescue the work ethic from the hands of neoliberal ideology and politics, and while avoiding the path of class struggle? I'm asking about the feasibility of this attempt, avoiding the antagonism, or maybe that it is, or more exactly, what we do with the politicians, economists, CEOs of the conservative ethic.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. So, a leading feature of the progressive work ethic is its opposition to essentially antagonistic social relations, which they see as being promulgated by capitalism and its associated conservative work ethic ideology. This idea that I can only have good things, right? Because other people have fewer things that are good, right? It's just absolutely pervasive in the conservative work ethic. But in a way, that ideology is even, this is what makes Smith so great, right? Adam Smith just stressed that, in principle, markets are places for mutual benefit. Like, we can both gain. Right? It's not just exploitative where I gain only at your expense. But there's a mismatch between the ideology, which assumes that, say, paying poor workers more is somehow at the expense of rich people. Right? Now, it is true that, because I believe in libertarianism, like the super rich, the top couple percent, right? They really do have to have less wealth. But in a way, it isn't, even for them. What is the wealth for, after all? Nobody in the top few percent of the global wealth distribution can possibly spend all that money on themselves. They can't. It's impossible to consume it. Elon Musk has $200 billion net worth. His actual consumption is an infinitesimal fraction of that. There's only so much money. Classic socialist observation, a rich person's stomach is not that much bigger than a poor person's stomach, right? There's only so much you can eat, a rich person might have a dozen houses, okay, scattered around the world. They could be very fancy houses, But really, how many houses can you consume? If you have 365 houses, you spend 1 day of each year in each house. Really, I mean, by that point, like, it's more costly to consume the housing that you own than it is to just stay in one place for a longer time. So there's actually no loss of consumption possibilities by massively taxing excessive concentrations of wealth. What the wealthy really resent from that taxation is not the loss of consumption possibilities, which is negligible. It's the loss of power over other people. That is, their ability to deploy their wealth to enact whatever ideological vision they want by controlling politics. But that's a power that nobody's entitled to have. And in a way, the fact that people have that power tends to select for megalomaniacs who just want to run everybody else's life. Why should we be rewarding them? Right. So in fact, I don't even think it makes them happy. I mean, do you think Elon Musk is a happy person? I think he's a narcissist who's inherently insatiable. He can never be happy. He thinks everybody has to worship him. And it's just an insatiable desire, and there's no reason to indulge that because he won't be any happier with extra billions. So it's not even no loss to him to limit his billions.
Elizabeth, you argue that the current neoliberal policies reflect priorities and methods from the 19th century, such as a criminalization of poverty and an ideologically driven notion of the serf, as you already explained. This assessment relies on a specific interpretation of economic history, which posits that progressive and conservative aspects of the work ethic have alternated since the Industrial Revolution. So in light of the ongoing effects resulting from the erosion of solidarity institutions, you propose a new progressive approach focused on restoring these institutions while integrating a stronger democratic dimension. So this leads me to ask whether the proposed solutions adequately address the historical dependence of European economies on the largely overlooked informal economy sector, which currently accounts for 32% of global GDP, and whose implications can still be seen in instances like the textile industry, where factories in underprivileged areas supply major brands, in consumer goods marketed by informal retailers, and particularly in extractivism, with mining serving as a prominent example. I raise this point considering that this complex relationship has been present since the beginnings of colonization processes and almost represents a parallel narrative that remains to be fully understood. So I wonder, what do you think about this complex relationship?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. So it is true that social democracy depends on the form, to extend social democracy, you have to formalize labor. There's really no other way. Otherwise, you don't have an adequate tax basis to fund all the rich social benefits. But there's more than one way to do that. And in particular, I think social democracy has inclined historically. It's actually been rather hostile, surprisingly hostile to workers' collectives. So you have co-determination, that's embedded in social democracy. But actual workers' cooperatives, not really. There's interesting reasons for this that have been explored empirically. It's just that social democracy was built through labor union organization. And labor unions are composed of wage laborers. And, the unions themselves are already then hooked into the wage relationship even though they're modifying it in pretty profound ways. But if you look in the history of the progressive work ethic, this tension comes out in different orientations to agricultural work. So John Stuart Mill is a pivotal figure on this point. So, you know, there was this ideology which I unpack as lying behind the Irish famine, which assumed that capitalist agriculture is the most productive. Okay. And, you know, now that we're running up against climate change and mass environmental destruction, the idea that capitalist modes of agriculture, and I would extend that to fishing, forestry, and so forth, where you have like, you know, a corporation or a very wealthy farmer owning the land, and then masses of impoverished, often informal workers working it. It's bad, you know, it's bad for the workers, and it's also bad for environmental sustainability to operate at that scale with monocropping and so forth. And I think it argues for a revival, actually, of small-scale peasant agriculture. It can still, peasant agriculture can still be integrated into the market because peasants are going to be producing surplus for the market. But we really have to, you know, rethink this. And, you know, I don't have enough of a handle on it. I just want to point out to the relative success of this model in Finland. So Finland undertook comprehensive land reform upon its independence from Sweden and later Russia. So if you look at forestry in Finland, for instance, it's very egalitarian. Foresters all have their small plot, right? And one of the things that does is create an incentive for sustainability. You can't like clear cut your forest all at once, right? Nobody's going to do that. Because, you know, they make a big bonanza up front, but then it's like another dozen years before they could possibly make another chunk of income. It's not sustainable. And so there's more potential actually for, I think, thinking creatively about sustainable agriculture by moving to small scale self-employed models. And that also argues against Modi's agricultural reforms, which of course were successfully defeated by peasant farmers who saw that they were going to get wiped out. Because Modi himself was stuck with this idea that you get higher productivity with large-scale capitalist farming model. And all the peasant farmers saw that that would doom them to degraded, like inferior work. They would be impoverished. But it's also, I think, probably not ecologically sustainable. So I think once you bring in the need for sustainable agriculture, given climate change and other environmental challenges, I think it forces us to rethink the agricultural sector. And this is all the more important in poor countries, or even middle-income countries such as Mexico. I think the North American Free Trade Agreement was a catastrophe for peasant farmers in Mexico and very unjust. It created a lot of social dislocation as their farms were taken over by American agricultural corporations. Disaster for Mexican communities. It's just really overall a bad idea. I think resources would have been better put into strengthening peasant agriculture.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you very much for your participation in our seminar, and especially for your time. It took much longer than we supposed originally.
Well, these were fabulous questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your answers. And yeah, but it was totally worth it, okay, at the time. So thank you all for your questions and your participations. And yeah, we'll see the next term for another
Wonderful.
seminar. Thank you,
Great.
Elizabeth. You all. Bye-bye.
Pleasure talking with you all.